So we're going to start this panel. Other participants of the conference are approaching. So first of all, I would like to thank you for being here till now and for visiting the conference. And it would sound not very humble, but I think that this panel is the most interesting one. Because the topic that we're going to discuss today is under-researched, and it's almost has not been discussed in the Ukrainian public sphere, in the informational space, but it's really important. And before introducing our dearest speakers, I would like to say that this issue popped up this year when we had a visit to Indonesia, and we talked to some of the representatives, like public opinion leaders. They were claiming about their they were telling about their sorry. About their sympathy towards Russian Federation, arguing that Russia gave us, for instance, the mosque in Jakarta, which is the biggest mosque in Southeast Asia, or Russia provided us with a stadium, with a huge stadium. It's great. And when we discussed it further with our diplomats, it appeared to be that it's not Russia, of course. It was during Soviet times, and many Ukrainian engineers, many Ukrainian constructors, they participated in this building. And it's not Russia, of course, but that was the participation of larger number of peoples that were at the time in the Soviet Union. So, and we understand that there were lots of projects that Soviet Union implemented in the countries of Africa, especially maybe, and in Asian countries, maybe less in Latin America. However, we might not know so well about that. Maybe it's time to claim Ukrainian ownership on all that heritage. But why it's complicated for us, maybe it's an explanation for our international guests. Because we are now going through the decommunization. We try to get rid of Soviet heritage that was really painful for Ukraine. We survived genocide, we survived repressions, etc. But can we distinguish somehow this heritage in the countries of the so-called global south, which is an argument that is used by Russia in order to get sympathy from the side of these countries, and our own painful internal process of decommunization and decolonization when it comes to Russian Federation. So now I will introduce the guests that are going to speak today about all this issue from the perspective of their experience and their kind of academia also background. So I will introduce them as they sit. On my left is Dr. Mridula Ghosh, Associate Professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Board Chair at the East European Development Institute. Ms. Mridula is well known in Ukraine, I think, so thank you for joining. We have also Professor Oleksii Haran, who is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the research director of the Democratic Initiative Foundation, representing Ukraine, of course. Then we have Ambassador Yevhen Mykytenko, who is an advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and former ambassador in many countries, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, Qatar, Egypt. So thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today. We have Dzvinka Kachur, who is the Vice President for Africa of the Ukrainian World Congress. Ms. Dzvinka joined us. We're lucky to have her because she came to Ukraine from South African Republic to participate in the events related to 1,000 days of Russian full-scale invasion. And last but not least, we have Oleh Bielokolos, who is the director of the Center for National Resilience Studies, political expert, diplomat, and Chargé d'Affaires of Ukraine in Kenya in 2008-2010. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists for the beginning to encourage them. And first of all, I will give the floor to the person that is the most experienced here, Ambassador Mykytenko. And of course, given your huge experience in diplomacy and the regions where you were posted as an ambassador, but also in other positions, diplomatic positions, what can you tell us, maybe just a little bit, some information that we can understand what is the level of engagement of Ukrainians in all those projects? Were there any particular projects that you were somehow like participating in as an ambassador, I mean, and interacting with Ukrainians that were there within those projects? So, and of course, the question that I will ask all the panelists is whether we as Ukrainians have to claim our ownership within this project to gain more support in the countries of the Global South. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you, Mariia. Really, it's a pleasure to be here this night. But as we are on the Ukrainian soil, I'd like to speak Ukrainian, please. Thank you.
First of all, you are quite right, Madam Mariia, when suggesting that since the time of the Soviet Union times, Ukraine was, and Ukrainians were, represented and involved in those regions, including Africa as well as Middle East as well, and the Central East as well. And this was quite obvious to me as the Arabist, as the expert in affairs of the Arabic countries, going back to 1976 and 1977 as well, when I was employed as a regular interpreter at a construction contract of a Soviet company which was working in, imagine where, Yemen, with irrigation system development. Back then we had quite many Russians, Kazakhs, but also many Ukrainians involved. But take my word for it, back then, and today as well, today is less than back then, but all of the Arabs and Africans would be calling all of the expats or coming from the Soviet Union, calling us Russi, the Russians, because they were not aware of existence of such countries like Ukraine, Belarus, or Kazakhstan. Time passed before they actually learned that there were different countries, different nations, different people, different languages, and so on. In other words, Yemen, that would be the start, next to the Hussites, at the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. We lived there, we worked there, we made friends with Yemens, we still rely on those communication channels, and they are still using those dams which were built back then, so you can imagine the quality of that construction. But I also would like us to come closer in history to the modern age and to tell you about the country which is quite interestingly located both in Africa and Asia. Can you guess the name of that country? Right, you are. Egypt. I believe everybody knows the Saad al-Ali, as the Arabs call it, the dam in a sun. Saad al-Ali is translated as the high dam. The height is 111 meters, while the height of the Cheops pyramid is a bit higher, 140 meters. But it took hundreds, if not thousands, of Ukrainian construction workers, primarily engineers, coming from Ukraine to build that dam in Soviet times. It was started in 1960 and finished in 1970. And there was a lot of equipment invested into that Aswan dam, most of that manufactured, namely in Ukrainian factories at the time. But let us also remember the city. All of you who visited Cairo do remember there's a city called Heluan. It was the location for the biggest steelmaking enterprise in Africa. And construction and then commissioning it into use was also made with involvement of Ukrainian engineers and equipment coming from Zaporizhia and other cities and manufacturing sites within the territory of Ukraine.
З Єгиптом вже коли ми стали
But I also remember the time of our cooperation with Egypt as we became an independent state, which was a very interesting historical period, because Egypt was the first among both African and Asian countries which have reached for very remarkable scope of trade balance, 2 billion annually in common trades, including supplies coming from Ukraine to Egypt. Different types of supply, starting with airplanes manufactured in Kharkiv, our construction. These would be Antonov 26. I do remember 3 vessels shipped there, and Mr. Andronenko, our ambassador, he knows the AN-26 perfectly well. Most frequently, these were used in the military sector. I don't know how is it going in Kharkiv currently, but Mr. Melitzer, who was managing that enterprise at the time, he came with one of that planes for the handover ceremony. But these are probably few people who know or remember. So please be reminded that Egypt was one of the first, both African and Arab countries, who launched a satellite into the space. And it was EgyptSat satellite, EgyptSat-1. It was manufactured at Pivden Mash factory. And I had the honor and pleasure of watching this satellite being assembled and then being transported to Baikonur, and then at Baikonur launch grounds it was launched into the space. It was actually carried on board of a Ukrainian rocket. It was a satellite aimed at exploration of the surface and environmental and aerial footage, but its resolution was high enough to make the footage with discrete resolution of 1 meter. Later on, there were more advanced technologies and other satellites launched, including the neighbors and competitors of Egypt, but at that time, Egypt was the first. And we helped the Egyptians to better study their own ground. Another thing of which probably most of us are unaware, it would be 10, almost 12 years that there is Naftogaz of Ukraine functioning quite efficiently in Egypt. I was at that contracting agency, that would be Alamashuish, the desert, where this company is located with its operations, and there are 30, maybe 40 Ukrainian engineers taking shifts, because this is quite a challenging place to live and work. But we're helping Egypt to extract natural gas. Following extraction, it's distributed like you should with such kind of produce. And again, this list can be continued. I could tell you more, but instead let me make a break and instead hand over the floor to the rest of our esteemed speakers. Thank you so much, Your Excellency.
information that you were just telling. I think it's pretty unique. I don't know if it was published, probably not. And it's a real challenge to get any information out about that. And thank you so much for telling us that. And we hope that you can tell us more. And now I would like to give the floor to another diplomat, to Mr. Oleh Bielokolos, who has also the diplomatic experience of working in Africa, but also he is a researcher. And I'm wondering what you, Mr. Oleh, can tell us on this matter. Maybe you've made some researches in Africa specifically, or maybe you talked to some people. By the way, sorry, just a little, just to say that one of our fellow colleagues, when we were looking for the speakers, and we were talking to her, because she's engaged with one of the research institutions, she just occasionally told us that her father was engaged in building the roads in Syria, and her grandfather was engaged in building the roads in Indonesia. So, but of course, these people now, they cannot tell about that more, about their experience, because one of them, he's not alive anymore, another one is pretty, he's not able to share this. But I mean, I feel pain because we're missing all that information. So, Mr. Oleh, can you maybe bring some more information to this picture for us?
Good evening. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, for inviting me. And I would like to start with one very short quotation from the speech of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic during the general discussion in the UN General Assembly in 1967. The Ukrainian SSR supports all decisions of the UN General Assembly aimed at the fastest possible elimination of colonial regimes. We stand for the immediate granting of independence to the peoples of the colonial territories. And I would like to say that I will confirm that that's not only words. Actually, the USSR started active development of economic relations in Africa in 70s, and as of 1979, the USSR had already trade agreements with 38 African countries. And the volume of Soviet African trade increased from 49 million rubles in 1955 to 1,671 million rubles in 1979. That's 33 times more. And 90% of all export volume was finished products and industrial goods. I will explain to you why it's so important for our discussion today. Soviet Union also built facilities for various purposes in Africa. In particular, as of January the 1st, 1980, 275 facilities had already been commissioned or implemented in Africa, of which 102 were industrial, as Ambassador mentioned, Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, Ethiopia, 26 agricultural, 10 transport, 97 educational, cultural, medical, sports, 3 residential and communal, 12 scientific. There are no specific statistics about what was the share of Ukraine or Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, because I don't think that these statistics simply exist. So if it exists, it's in Moscow, and it's highly confidential even today, especially today maybe. But for all, I would like to inform you, maybe for us Ukrainians, we know that, but many people around the world don't know that in 70s, in 80s, and 60s, Ukraine was the most industrial advanced part of the Soviet Union. I have lots of statistics, but there are many, for example, the share of metal production, 35.7%, steel pipes, 34.1%, excavators, coal cleaning machines, transport equipment, rolling equipment, 24% of large electric machines. Yesterday, one speaker mentioned powerful gas turbine engines from Mykylaev. Of course, Ukraine had a huge military-industrial complex those days, which also exported widely to African countries. I would like to also mention Luhansk diesel locomotive plant, well-known plant, exported locomotives around the world to Netherlands, Poland, Bulgaria, and to Egypt, Syria, Cuba, Guinea. For example, in 1971, 1985, 250 locomotives were manufactured especially for these countries that I mentioned, Egypt, Syria, Cuba, and Guinea. What else? Fertilizers, agricultural equipment, chemical products. And of course, in a sense of logistics, all these products were exported to Africa, to the countries. Those days they were called third world countries, from Ukraine and from Ukrainian ports. You could ask me, okay, that's good statistics that you gave us. Do you have any confirmation, any personal information? I have actually information that I could share with you. My grandfather was ambassador to Zambia and Botswana 1970-1976. And I have information from what was done in Zambia during these 6 years. Actually, agricultural equipment for medical faculty for Zambia University, equipment for road construction, and 400 wells to assist people to have an access to clear water. For those who know what's going on in Africa, there are still people in many countries that do not have access to to clean water, which is, so you could imagine how was important this work. And he told me when he was retired and I was a student of the faculty for international relations here in Kyiv, and he told me that more than 60% of embassy staff were from Ukraine, including military personnel. Zambia those days, before 1974, was the main hub for liberation movements in Angola, in Mozambique. And for those who would like to know more, I have lots of information regarding this. Some information also about Ukraine participation in Africa. When I was in our embassy, diplomat in our embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, I talked to a doctor from Ukraine. He told me a story when he was a doctor in hospital in Kisumu, built by Soviet Union and opened in 1969. And he was a doctor there during last years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he told me that 80% of the staff, medical staff, were from Ukraine. So I heard a lot of discussions today about propaganda and counter-propaganda. And I have my personal idea, message, I don't know. If you could come back to your countries and tell your compatriots, your friends, then Russia is killing right now children and grandchildren of the people who actually assisted your countries to achieve political and economic independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is a very important message, I believe. And of course, very valuable, important information. Thank you for that. And now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Mridula Ghosh, who herself came to Ukraine several decades ago as a student from India, within this educational interaction between Soviet Union and India in particular. Dr. Mridula, what can you tell us maybe more about the role of Ukraine in the India-USSR interaction and cooperation? What was this role, and whether now India knows anything about that, because Ukraine knows not so much?
Thank you very much for having me on this panel. Esteemed guests, I would like to start with the fact that in India, everyone knows about Ukraine. It's something that goes without saying, because after Ukraine attained independence, within a few, I think it was in December, the referendum was held, and in January, there was a full-scale diplomatic relations established. And in no time, in May, the first mission with one of the most top diplomats, Pravat Prakash Shukla, who's retired now, he came here with a little box with his assistant in the hotel to open the embassy. And of course, that was the beginning when we had, and I had a contract with the ministry for almost a year, establishing the embassy here, creating the database and helping my country. I feel honored to share this information with you today. At that point, there was a tremendous interest, and several other professionals joined. Both of them retired this year. One was Taranjit Sandhu, who was the ambassador to the United States, and his wife Rinat Sandhu, who was recently the ambassador to the Netherlands. So they were then third secretaries and second secretaries. So during my short period of contract, they wanted me to join and work, but I preferred to do my research. I did not want to join and become a bureaucrat. During that time, I found that we had a meeting with Volodymyr Gorbulin, who wanted to establish his old friends in Hyderabad and in the ISRO. So he has even brought a little model of a tank. The history goes very deep. This tank was a model which Ukraine had prepared. And at that point, he said, it'll be very useful for you. Years later, in 1997, India was lukewarm about it. And then finally, they got the contract with Pakistan. So there's a long history of all these different negotiations and other stuff. We had negotiations over the aircraft carrier. Lots of defense delegations were coming. And in fact, it was an uphill working relationship which had nothing to do whatsoever with any Russian influence, any Russian backbiting, nothing of that type. It started much later. Perhaps in this century it started, not in the 90s. In the 90s, it was a lot of other embassies were also established in the Central Asian republics and in the Caucasus. I know in Armenia, for example, we have a very deep relationship with Armenia. India has old relationships. Going back to the Soviet legacy, it started after actually de-Stalinization. During Stalin's time, normally, it was not, and I believe cooperation in general started after decolonization of the world, in fact, in the 60s. After that, Soviet Union became a big provider of aid. And in the Cold War, as you know, aid was used as a model. It brought its management model, it brought its socialist management model and other things. And so we had two different types of systems and two different types of view, ideology, and together, working. India adopted a mixed economy model. And in this model, there was the 5-year plan, which was something that Nehru wanted to have implemented. And one of the very important things is we have very serious technological institutes that's called the IIT. And these IIT, the core group that went to have this IIT set up, at the head of the delegation was somebody from Odessa in the name of Mesherikov. So, such stories I can go on telling. But cutting the long story short, someday probably we will have a book where we can read about all this. Maybe myself, maybe with my colleagues, we can put it together, and it'll be useful. I think the archives could be a good help for us to get all this information together. But if we take Soviet aid in terms of figures, yes, there is an estimate in the United Nations. I later worked for the United Nations after I finished my research. So, there I had a very different perspective of what the aid was and how everything worked. So at that point, recently I found that, of course, Ukraine was a founder member. That was very important factor for us, being very importantly, working with Ukraine. Us means already the UN. I was a staff member. So the point that in 47-48, during the voting on Kashmir, Ukraine had a vote in the Security Council. Please look into archives, I'm not misinforming you, and Ukraine voted in favor of India. This is very interesting and symbolic to mention today when we talk about Crimea. When we talk about the territorial integrity and all these other things that even our leaders are promising every time they come, visit, or they say anything. On this backdrop, the political relationship is somehow landed on a thaw because of the tank deal with Pakistan, but that was a kind of a rhetoric. Of course, because of the nuclear test that we had, because Ukraine had the Budapest Memorandum, and it did not accept any kind of nuclear proliferation, which they take if any country conducts nuclear tests. So therefore, there was some cold relation until President Kuchma visited in 2002. And then the ball started rolling. However, always there was this problem, how to separate, I wouldn't say dehyphenate, but at least decouple from the Soviet legacy and turn it into something useful, whether to just throw it away or what to do with it. Because everyone you talk to, of the older generation, even the politicians, of course, the leftist parties are a very serious contingent and a very big component in this anti-colonial or, the post-colonial scholars. They would all say that this is something that was like, Soviet Union was like the anti-West, and so it was something positive. They have their own, stereotypes and other things. What I would like to say is that in this debate, perhaps what was lost was the major legacies that will help Ukraine in reinforcing its identity. I drew out at least 2 factors that will immediately appeal to any Indian, anybody in our subcontinent, not even Indian. It is the language issue, and it is the issue of the famine. The many times our subcontinent had famine, they were all man-made, human-made famine. And in this context, Holodomor says a lot, because that is something even my grandmother's generation, my parents' generation saw it during the Second World War. The other issue is the language, because I'm a carrier of Bengali language. I come from the eastern part of India. And of course, you know, the creation of Bangladesh was made possible because of the language issue, because of they were prohibited in speaking Bengali, and that's why there was the language movement which started in 1952. These two issues at least will appeal to everyone. If you say today that Ukrainian language, and that has almost, you know, during the past few decades of my existence, I've been trying to prove that through translations, through other things. There is a limited realization, but let me come back to what, you know, the panel believes that, you know, this is an ethical dilemma. No, I would say no, this is not an ethical dilemma. This is an ethical necessity today. I would reformulate it. Why is it an ethical necessity? Because it's a survival of the state of Ukraine. It's the identity of Ukraine that has to be protected. So therefore, we have to draw those useful, important aspects of the Soviet legacy, which was there, even through, you know, the Soviet authors, Soviet time authors, let's say, or the interpretations of the Ukrainian literature is important, because during the Soviet-Ukraine relationship, there were a number of delegations who came here, especially in the area of culture, who have highly evaluated authors like the classics, you know, the Shevchenko, Lesia Ukrainka, and even Tychina. Tychina's writings were very highly appreciated, although we know Tychina was hailed as a Soviet poet, and he was an officer, he was a you know, minister in the Soviet government. What is less exposed is the Rada government during the revolution times. You know, that is something, a very bizarre thing that is not very well exposed. A lot of other discussions are very banal, and I would say there is some kind of, you know, I would risk telling that there is this intellectual handicap. What do I mean by it? I mean that when anything Soviet, we say in India, is by default Russian. It is something that should be very humiliating for any scholar. Similarly, it should be a very big problem for any scholar to describe Russia-India relationship as historical. Why? Because there is no history. It starts from 1991. There was no Russia before. It was the Soviet Union. And today it is repeatedly told by anybody that it is a historical relationship. What do you mean? Did you have equal relationships with Russian Empire? But we had the British Empire at that time. What do the scholars mean by that? You know, I definitely would like to challenge this, that there is no history in this relationship. We are usurping, we are allowing Russia to usurp the Soviet history and throw away whatever Ukrainian, whatever genuinely Ukrainian, which Ukraine can today say that it is ours, and let us start from there. So always, Ukraine-India relations start from 1991. But you read any book, any diplomatic annals, they will say, well, Russia-India relationship starts from 1946. I question it, because this is absolutely, it carries no diplomatic legitimacy, it has no, I mean, it is, honestly, it is intellectual handicapped. I mean, I just cannot talk after this, when anyone says this. I would just quickly say two things. One more thing is the academic. This is affecting the academia, this is affecting the training of the young generation, who are not growing with the thought that there has been a transition from the Soviet to the Ukrainian. So how healthy we make this transition, what useful things from the Soviet legacy we can take. Like, we will not be able to tell outrightly that the trolleybus line from Simferopol to Yalta was not useful. It was useful, and it was made by the Ukrainians. I mean, maybe Soviet time Ukrainians, but they were the Ukrainian workers who worked. And of course, all these other defense and other collaborations. But I would look into the intellectual, cultural, and social component, because that is very easy to address. For the moment, I'll stop at that. Thank you for the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mridula. And actually, it's important to say that recently there was a post in the Facebook of the current Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Sybiha, and after his trip to Africa, he proclaimed it was as one of the priority actually to decolonize this Soviet heritage, to understand what is the role of Ukrainians, and I think he even brought some of the diploma or some documents related to the study of one of the leaders of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. If I'm not mistaken, it was Ethiopia, right? Yes, and gave it to him, and that, of course, helped to make these relations more better. Let's put it like that. So now I would like to go to another female speaker of our panel. By the way, have you noticed that we have like a perfect gender balance in this panel? So it is Dzvinka Kachur, and as Dzvinka represents the diaspora, Ukrainian diaspora in African countries, I'm wondering what you could say on that, but maybe also on this ethical side of the problem. Do you feel comfortable when we are surviving this war and you fight a lot in order for African people, in particular in South African republics, know more about the Russian colonial practices and what Ukraine experienced? How do you feel, about talking on Ukrainian engagement in all these Soviet projects? Does it contradict somehow this messaging that you do now? And what's the attitude of Ukrainians in Africa? Do they realize what was the role of Ukrainians in some of these projects that was even mentioned by our great speakers before?
Thank you, and thanks a lot for having me here. When I read the topic for this panel, should Ukraine claim its Soviet heritage, my academic background kicked in, and I thought, okay, so what was the Soviet Union, right? It was 15 republics, so how much of that was Ukraine? Because for Russia, as a colonial power, it's quite easy. They just changed the name of Soviet Union to Russia in UN without any supporting documents, and everybody's fine with that. I understand that Ukraine can't do that because simply we are not empire and we cannot replace 15 republics. In South Africa, at the Freedom Park, there was a Soviet Union anti-apartheid fighters. One day in 2022, Russia simply replaced that plate with Russia, without conversation, without anything. So for us, to claim that Soviet heritage, we really need to do work on deconstruction. Secondly, I think there is one thing to do the strategy of how the Soviet Union was working on the African continent, but it can also change because of the implementation. So, for example, if students from South Africa were studying in Ukraine, how different was this experience to them studying in Russia? If this dam in Egypt was built by Ukrainians, how different it was? How much the Ukrainian identity influenced the implementation of the Soviet strategy on working between the Soviet Union and the African continent? And thirdly, I think another very important part of what it meant for African countries. Like, if we talk about South Africa, who was silenced? Because Soviet Union was supporting only specific voices and did not support the others. How the freedom fighters movement have changed because of Soviet ideology, and what did it mean for South Africa or many other African countries? So to answer all those questions, we obviously need to do research, we need to do all the data collection, we need to analyze those data, and then have an honest conversation. At the time of war, we can't afford that. And then the activist kicks in me, and our practice. A practice is that in September this year, in South Africa, political representatives of 3 different parties have attacked Ukrainian community living in South Africa, saying that you are imperialists. Because Russia stood with us, Russia supported us, we have to stand with Russia, and Ukraine are part of imperialist thinking. as a Ukrainian, you're obviously shocked. So you are immediately kicked into educating of what Ukrainian history was. And history is that between 1963 and 1965, 365 Unkondovo activists studied in Odessa, not anywhere else at the territory of Ukraine. In 1962, Oliver Tambo, one of the African National Congress leaders, wrote a thank you letter to the head of Ukraine Soviet Republic because Ukraine has supported South Africa and voted in support of the resolution against anti-apartheid. In 1985, Ukraine was a driver behind implementing sanctions against South Africa. This building where we are today is named after Hennady Udovenko, and he was deputy chair of the anti-apartheid committee between 1985 and 1992, when Ukraine was already independent. Hennady Udovenko, second Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, was on a deputy chair of anti-apartheid committee. He was supporting multiple resolutions and was well known by the activists in South Africa. So I'm happy to say that during Ukrainian Minister Sybiha's visit last month, the plate to Hennady Udovenko was open at the Freedom Park in Pretoria, and now there is a new line that says Ukraine. We will work on moving some of the Ukrainians from the Russian section, which used to be Soviet Union, into Ukrainian section. So we really are claiming that heritage because it is used as an attack against Ukraine. Yes, maybe we condemned Soviet Union, an oppressive system of Soviet Union that worked on a Ukrainian territory, but we cannot afford to be silent when Russia is using this narrative as an to attack Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dzvinka, for this important notes. And it's great to know that this already been done. So that's not something that's, or that it's something that Ukrainian diaspora is already working on. That's great. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Haran, who probably within previous 2 years traveled the most of all Ukrainians, at least Ukrainian scholars, within the countries of the Global South and talked a lot to intellectuals, probably to decision makers, to journalists. And Professor, what's your take on that matter? Do you think that those countries would like to know more about the role of Ukrainians in all that Soviet projects, or do we have to raise this issue at all? Can it be helpful in our dialogue with the Global South?
The short answer is yes, we should.
Can you grab the mic, please?
The short answer is yes, we should. I was hesitating what language to speak because there's a lot of delicate issues, so maybe I will switch to Ukrainian. For to ensure that translation would be good, correct. My Ukrainian is better than my English, fortunately or unfortunately. Okay.
So I said the short answer would be yes. Was it Russian that I started? Let me explain why it happened. Because there is explanation, in fact. So the short answer would be yes. We have to understand that Soviet legacy is legacy of the Russian Empire, of course. But at the same time, in that heritage, there are some things which were made by Ukrainians. And despite the fact that the Russian Union, the Soviet Union was an empire, dictatorship, a bloodshedding dictatorship, nevertheless, there were poets and writers who were glorifying Lenin and Stalin, and most of them died at that zero level, but some of them were wonderful in their lyrics. They were translating Western pieces into Ukrainian, and there are multiple examples to that. Also, we can recall an example which might be interesting to our friends, some friends from the so-called third world countries, such as national communism phenomenon, which in Ukraine was up until the 20s. So these were people who believed in communism, but at the same time seeing the future of Ukraine as an independent communist republic. And they made a major contribution in Ukrainianization, particularly in the Russian-speaking municipalities in Ukraine, such as Odessa, Donetsk, and others. And this contribution indeed is tremendously important. All of them were repressed by Stalin in 1930s. So this was the dead end for the civilizational curve. But speaking of my case, I have to confess that, first of all, I have always been Russian-speaking up until certain time. I have always been stupid enough to believe in communism and also to believe that Russians are our brothers, Ukrainian nationalists being our enemies, and the rest of the Soviet ideology. I described that in my memoirs, starting with Brezhnev and coming to Zelensky. But then I experienced a collapse of my values when I learned some true facts about what happened and how. And thus, I do believe that this experience of the Soviet Ukraine and the collapse of communist-style thinking and all of the repressions that we survived as Ukrainians, they also were developing in the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, because indeed, Soviet Union committed multiple crimes in those countries. Do you remember Afghanistan? Killing millions of Afghanis. Marxist dictatorship, like in Ethiopia, collectivizations using Soviet-style templates, resulting in forceful starvation, and also other subjects which are sensitive and delicate enough, and they should be approached respectively, because some of the countries still sustain the positive image of the Soviet Union, who believe that Soviet Union was helping them to survive. And thus, we have to do a lot to deconstruct this Soviet-style care and support, because we still have it as one of the items in the African National Congress that Russia has always been our supporter, and definitely we cannot condemn it at this moment. And there are other examples again that Madam Mridula has indicated in regard to India. And definitely we should not leave it unattended. And we have to demonstrate that Ukraine, both as part of the Soviet Union, was also making its contribution, and the Soviet Union does not equal to Russia. And also, as Dzvinka mentioned, we should be mindful that Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, was one of the founding countries of the United Nations Organization, and in fact, Ukrainian diplomats were very active in decolonization processes. Yes, these were Soviet diplomats, and the school of Soviet diplomacy was kind of a trick, whatever the Ukrainian is for the trick. It's not the magician's trick. It was a performance trick of Soviet propaganda, but yet Ukraine had a role to play in making those tricks as well. Also, we could recall Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia back in 1946. He appealed to the residents of Indonesian city of Jakarta to come into the streets and manifest their gratitude to Ukrainian Soviet Republic, because it was USSR who initiated discussions on independence of Indonesia. So again, this is also part of our legacy. On the one hand, we have to demonstrate that the Soviet Union was an empire, colonial style, while on the other hand, yes, indeed, this is just happened to be that this empire was helping some of the countries, and substantial part, if not the leading part of that assistance delivery, is accredited to Ukraine. But looking into that legacy of that future, it does look attractive when we are describing that together with other countries of the Eastern Europe who also share similar experience, such as Poland, Lithuania. They also will be telling the same story, not just Ukraine, but all other countries who've been either part of the Russian Empire or under the reign of communism. Thank you, Professor, on that.
The questions you would like to ask, but in the meantime, I would like also to ask some additional questions. First of all, Ambassador Mykytenko, back to you. My question would be about whether you think that all these findings that you were talking about, like about Ukrainian role in all those projects, can be useful now in the diplomatic work that your current colleagues are doing. And now we have, for instance, more embassies, Ukrainian embassies in Africa, whether it should be the point of their narratives that they're trying to communicate to the countries they posted in order to gain more sympathy towards Ukraine and make Ukraine more recognizable and to distinguish Ukraine from Russia. Do you think that's a good point for the communication in general?
Дякую.
Thank you so much. And I do believe that we should first understand what the history is teaching us. History is a very heavy subject because there are so many curves, sometimes U-turns in historical process, dashing back and forth in relationship with different countries. Let me also refer to an example of the ancient Saudi Arabian kingdom, Najd, and SSSR. Diplomatic relationships were instituted, if I remember it right, in 1932, following Stalin's initiative. Because back in those days, the SSSR was one of the countries who were first to recognize the Najd kingdom as part of Saudi Arabia region. Moreover, Russia, namely Russian Federation, opened the embassy back in those days. Later on, the history continued to evolve. The World War II, and then in the field of diplomatic cooperation, the Americans came on board, British came on board as well, and also this diversified relationship of the Saudi Arabia, which is one of the giants, the lion in the Arab world, or the so-called third world countries. And the initiative was snatched by the Western countries. And then the new twist, when for quite a long time, diplomatic relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union were frozen.
І лише в
And only in 1992, I think, I might be wrong, a year or two, Saudi Arabia and Russia reinstated its diplomatic relationship. In this context, what's interesting that Ukraine has established a diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think in 1995. And in 1996, Ukraine opened its embassy there. So among former Soviet republics, after Russia, Ukraine was the second that opened its embassy in Riyadh. By the way, because I was the first ambassador there, we were second, and Kazakhstan came like 5 months after us. Kazakhstan became the third former Soviet country that opened an embassy in Riyadh. So we helped them in this. So why why am I remembering Saudi Arabia? Because it's the future of the Arabic world. And I have a sincere opinion that the strongest country which has the best perspectives in its development among the Arabic countries, it's Iraq. It used to be, and it is. Iraq is the only country that has huge oil reserves. We shouldn't forget that. Huge gas deposits in north and south. And it's the country where they remember the Ukrainians. I came to Iraq, especially in the south of Ukraine, in Basra. There were hundreds of Ukrainian engineers working, helping the Iraqis to extract oil. Unfortunately, the history is such a thing that, well, Saddam Hussein, essentially with his policy, he destroyed the strongest, the most developed country of the Arab world. Why? Because Iraq was the only country which had everything. Not just oil and gas. They had a lot of good fertile soil and that's very important, a lot of water in Tigris and Euphrates. This is the country which had the best perspective. But once again, these twists of history are such that Iraq is now not in the leading position. So I'm proud of being the first ambassador of Ukraine to Saudi Arabia. And when I came to Riyadh, our the turnover in trade was about $24–25 million a year. So that's just peanuts. I left Riyadh in 2000, and the turnover was about $100 million a year. Before the war, we've set a record. Our turnover with Saudi Arabia was $900 million a year before the war. So an important partner. And if you know, the Saudis, like 3 months ago, they bought 13% of our largest producer of chicken, of poultry, the so-called MHP. 13% are now owned by the Saudis. And with our help, they now breed chicken for their consumption and for exporting it to other countries. So if we didn't have war, we would have even stronger relationship. Another thing, I'm sure Ambassador Mykytenko would agree with me, it's very important to take part in expos, to showcase countries, so that the countries would know each other better, would look at people, would talk with each other, and so on and so on. I remember 1997, a year after the embassy was open, we have conducted the first solo expo in the city of Tomak, in the east of Saudi Arabia. where they extract oil and gas. And can you imagine, in that city, Dammam, our huge Mariia plane was landing back then. Mariia, in one flight, brought everything and all the participants of that solo exhibition of Ukraine. From all other neighboring countries, from Iran, from Kuwait, from the UAE, there were coming thousands of people to just attend our exhibition and to look at the Mariia plane. And it was supposed to depart in a week. I remember it was supposed to be at 5 o'clock, 5 a.m. And around the airfield, there were thousands of locals and other people who came, other Arabs from Kuwait, from other countries. They all had their cameras, their VCRs, filming this marvelous plane. That was a great showcase. So with God's help, after peace, well, I'm not even saying victory, knock on wood, after peace we must start everything from scratch. We must rebuild Ukraine and then showcase it. Yeah, Mr. Ternenko, Ambassador Ternenko, will help us or follow him. He is our future. Thank you so much. Thank you. We have invited Mr. Ambassador, but he thought that you would be a very dignified speaker, so he politely gave his seat to you. And after the two previous speakers, I feel the need to speak in Ukrainian. I will continue in Ukrainian, and I will ask an additional question to Mr. Oleg. Whether you think, looking at your experience in diplomacy, whether you think that this topic of Ukrainian legacy in Soviet activities in Global South countries can be helpful to modern diplomats, can be a point to use, can be a driving force for our work in African countries, amongst others?
I do think so. And first of all, we were not an empire in our history. We don't have any experience in conquering other people. That's why we could talk without any. We could freely, openly talk to the people. We have many things in common. For example, as some speakers mentioned, we are fighting for our identity, to preserve our national heritage. It's, as far as I understand, and I talk to people in Tanzania, Kenya, it was also a part of anti-colonial movement. And even today, it could resonate with them. The other reason is we didn't mention here in this panel, this discussion, the training of students and specialists from the countries of from Africa, Asia, Latin America. I was a student, and a few of us so-called Soviet students, but 80% of students were from Africa, Middle East, Latin America, Asia. I have maybe just very short quotation, but it's important because it's document. There's a subject of the address of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine to General Assembly in 1969. Ukrainian SSR, being a co-author of the relevant resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, in practice confirmed its desire to provide the necessary assistance to the countries of the Third World. Currently, citizens from these countries study in 60s universities and technical school of the Republic. This quotation. In the city of Zaporizhia, there were permanent UN courses for training of metallurgical specialists. Over the past 8 years, more than 10,000, I should emphasize, 10,000 specialists from developing countries have been trained or upgraded their qualifications in Ukraine. By any standards, by any means, it's a huge numbers. We have to collect all this information. We have to put this information in modern ways and maybe distribute this information in countries of Global South. I don't like it. I think we have to say about Big South. The South is really big. So I would like to introduce this terminology as a Big South. And we want the substantial part of this Big South to be on our side, to be on the side of good against evil. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And do we have any questions? So we have some questions. Let's take several questions. And let's give the priority to our international, guests. Please, Swasti Rao, please bring the mic.
That's so sweet. Thank you. So, of course, I have a question. You know why, as I was listening to what Professor Ghosh was saying, and of course, she's hit the nail on the head, which is that we actually start wrong. You know, we are always saying that the India-Russia relationship goes back a long way, when fact is that it's the Soviet-India relationship and all that. But what I want to draw a parallel with, Dr. Ghosh, is what she was saying about South Africa. If you see that it's about finding a commonality of experience, right? I mean, why is it that India also feels a special place for South Africa because of what Mahatma Gandhi and his experience out there has been, etc. In your opinion, how do you think we can make a beginning? I mean, I completely understand the problem and the juncture of the problem, but then how do we make a beginning? You know there is a stiff resistance in many ways. If I can use that term, that academic laziness, or I don't think it's academic laziness, I think it's academic resistance. So how, in your opinion, can we sort of have a similar kind of an experience where we can share, we can go back and trace a shared history like we have done, very successfully with countries like South Africa and all that? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. I would say that there is no universal recipe for these things, but academically, it is up to the particular academics who are, for whatever reasons, career prospects, position, trips, anything, more banal substances, right? Let's agree that they try to kowtow the Russian line, willingly or unwillingly. But I would say, going deep into it, when you have your student writing a PhD thesis and always repeating the Russian narratives in them, that is where I think the Indian academic elite should protest. There is an academic honesty. There is a reason why we cannot compromise with half-truth and distorted truth. So there is something that we should not allow ourselves to be swayed by any propaganda. We don't do it in the case of the United States. We don't do it in the case of the United Kingdom. So why we should do it in the case of Russia, which is trying to usurp the Soviet Union? So this is the problem, a very serious problem, which is for years, for decades, perpetuated by the academic elite, especially people who trained students of international relations. And then they enter the foreign ministry. And then it goes all over, you know. So this is a very sad story. Unfortunately, this is something that the policymakers need to think very seriously, because we look honestly, I would tell you honestly, sometimes Indian speakers from the academic elite, they look so funny when they speak in the public. They look really ridiculous when they repeat the Russian narrative. I mean, I'm afraid that this is a conference which I should not be, you know, diminishing it into these banal statements, but honestly, will that person be able to do the same thing if, you know, going to Oxford or other places, you know? So I would like also the politicians have a role to play, the politicians who are intellectual politicians, like we have Shashi Tharoor, we have other people, they realize it very much. And of course, the leftists need to think it different, because in India, leftists are a very powerful force. So they need to think, where does this spirit of anti-colonialism lie? Why is Russian imperialism and colonialism better? In what way? In what way are we supporting it? Is it not a question pertinent to be posed today? So, you know, it is all on you, all on your generation, and further on, that there should be a very serious debate. Unfortunately, these debates are not so much encouraged in India. We know it, unfortunately. It needs time, it needs to go against the tide. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from other speakers?
Так, певна річ, маємо ми ще запитання. Так, просимо Джулія. Перепрошую, так, Єгоре, почнемо з вас. Так, Єгор Булян, радий вітати. Я є український історик та журналіст. Наразі досліджую Британську імперію, в тому числі новоколоніалістичний, постколоніалістичний період в Карибському регіоні. Але з іншого боку, друге моє проявлення – це журналізм, тож я пишу про російську пропаганду, інформаційну безпеку. І коли мова, власне, заходить про радянський спадок в азіатському, південно- чи північноамериканському навіть регіоні, то значна частина того є пропагандою або проантипропагандою. Але коли мова йде за Україну, то це завжди була антизахідна пропаганда, особливо в таких публікаціях, як магазин «Перець». Але питання моє полягає в наступному. Чи ми
explaining how Soviet propaganda was working in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Because actually, one of the biggest information manipulations which was done by KGB in the 80s, they did this manipulation that AIDS was created in the US biolabs, and it was done via one KGB-controlled Indian newspaper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, that was a comment, right? If any of the panelists would like to comment? No, yes, sure.
Shall we take one more question? There was one more question.
Okay. No, we will take it, sure. Okay, Julia, please. Позаду.
Thank you so much. My name is Yulia Chikolba. I'm from Center for Information Resilience. I have a question that relates to the darker part of our Soviet inheritance. I spent some time working in Middle East and Central Asia, in particular in Afghanistan. When I was saying that I'm Ukrainian, I was accepted by local population because they hate Russia, especially in some areas like Panjshir Valley. The sentiment against Russians is massive. And Ukraine managed to utilize this, like, Ukraine is not Russia, we are not Soviets, because like in Mazar-e-Sharif you had Russian candies selling and people were accepting. But my question is also in Iraq, for example, Ambassador mentioned, but there are a lot of people who have a massive nostalgia for Saddam Hussein in Iraq now. And they like Soviet Union, and they inherently like Russia. as a representative of Soviet Union, and there are people against that. So my question is, how should we communicate the complexity of our imperial inheritance? Because I don't want to remove responsibility from us as Ukrainians for invasion of Afghanistan, for example. So how should we communicate this complexity to different countries, and how should we communicate this complexity to different audiences within the certain countries? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question. Professor Dzvinka, you would like to start, and then we'll move to Professor also and other speakers.
Thanks a lot. I think, thank you for all three questions. They're extremely important. I think decolonizing the history of Ukraine and understanding of Ukraine is extremely important, because we understand that, first of all, it's not given that academics around the world do know our history. And yes, maybe it's not fair to put responsibility on Ukrainians, but we do want to take that responsibility and to share as much information, knowledge, research with academics around the world on what Ukrainian history is. I also would like to ask anyone who is linked to academia, whether in Ukraine or around the world, to help us promote this topic as a research, because we do need to find more data, establish more information about the situation. With regards to promoting propaganda and whether Ukraine can communicate how the Soviet propaganda worked, I think definitely Soviet Union was a great example of that. And if we take, for example, South Africa, it was not just the Soviet Union propaganda machine, but that machine was fighting against apartheid propaganda. And their interaction and narratives, I think, are strongly felt even today, because some of the narratives that are part of current disinformation campaigns were designed during Soviet Union or by apartheid forces. Like we have this famous white monopoly capital, was designed by the Soviet Union, or the example that you mentioned, that Soviet Union designed this campaign that HIV is not really a disease, it is made by Western forces. In South Africa, Thabo Mbeki resisted implementing retrovirus therapy for almost a decade, resulting in millions of South Africans suffering. So this story is still unknown, but it doesn't mean that British company that was doing PR in South Africa didn't use white monopoly capital against South Africa itself. The famous Bell Pottinger company also used the same term. So I think the field of disinformation is extremely complex. And yes, we can share case studies. South African can share case studies. We can learn from each other and definitely benefit from this. And on the topic of complexity, I think this is something that we all puzzling, because I don't think this work has been done. It does take a lot of reflection on what the Soviet Union was. And my personal answer, I start with, like, Soviet Union was an oppressive system, systemic oppression of people, especially those who were colonies like Ukraine, but also people during the whole Soviet Union and in other countries. But it doesn't mean that there was nothing good done. So we just try to establish as many facts as we can, so that afterwards we can reflect on them.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, Professor, and then Ambassador, please.
Regarding the question of responsibility of Ukrainians in some historic issues, well, look, we shouldn't idealize our history. So yes, in our history of Ukrainians, yes, there were moments which we need to take responsibility for. I mean, medieval history of Ukraine, and for example, the pogroms which were in medieval ages conducted by Cossacks. Cossacks are our hero, but nevertheless, they also conducted some very tragic things. So anti-Jewish pogroms that were in 17th and 18th century. Yes, this is the truth. It happened. They should be put in historic context, but nevertheless we are responsible for that. The tragic Polish-Ukrainian war during World War II in Western Ukraine, where Poles were killing Ukrainians, Ukrainians were killing Poles, including civilians, and famous Polish dissident Adam Michnik, he said that both sides should say mea culpa, my guilty. So yes, we need to take responsibility for that. But if we are talking, look, Ukraine didn't have a state for most of its history. So it was part of other empires. And if we are taking the issue of Afghanistan, well, I think there were Ukrainians who were part of Soviet repressive force in Afghanistan who should also take responsibility. Yeah, that's right. I cannot exclude it. But if we try to generalize, so I think we need to understand that Ukrainians were a conquered nation at that time, and Ukrainians were forced to serve in the Soviet army. And so I'm not sure that all Ukrainians should take responsibility for that. This is a part, you know, of the communist regime which existed in the Soviet Union in general. So there are different issues and different nuances. But no nation is ideal. That's
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador, please.
Yeah, дякую.
Yes, thank you so much. I'd like to suggest a small reflection regarding Saddam Hussein. Indeed, we should study history extensively and thoroughly. Indeed, this was a very strong, even heroic person, individual who gradually grew into an authoritarian leader of an autocratic country, one of the richest countries in the region. And I do know that many people loved Hussein because back then propaganda in Iraq was extremely strong. I do remember, I know that because I worked in the Russian embassy, in the Soviet embassy in Baghdad since 1986 through 1990, 4 years totally. But I did know some people, the Kurds living in the northern part of Iraq, who hated Saddam, who were perpetrated by Saddam. He used the poisonous gases against them. But other people would be worshipping him. They thought that he was leader and father of the nation and leader of the entire Arabic world. But Saddam committed two fatal mistakes. First of all, when he started the war, it was him who started the war with Iran. It was August 1980, when Iran was weak and having involved Iraq into 8 years of war, which resulted in basically a draw. But all of the servicemen came back home and they wanted to have something on top of just coming back home. And then in August 1990, Saddam committed the second fatal mistake when he sent his army to the neighboring Kuwait. And when he called this Kuwait province of Iraq number 19, doesn't that remind us of something? Because, again, Saddam passed away, and God be with him. But history has many facets to it, and sometimes it repeats itself. It does evolve, but it evolves in cycles. But that means that our cycle of a better future will come to us. And also, I promise to share the floor with Madam Mridula and then you, Oleh. I would rather focus our attention on the historical aspects and affairs in a more general manner, applying more studies, because some of the pages in Ukrainian history can be interpreted in different ways, sometimes in controversial ways, including that in India, such as Bandera, such as Ukrainian nationalism. And the approaches to that interpretation, particularly the denazification processes, these are kind of ambiguous. In our history, we had Suvash Chandra Bose also as a controversial figure because he was fighting against British colonialism, being the national hero, and his airport in Kolkata has its name. And he, on the 23rd of January, which is his birthday, we celebrate the national holiday. So, because again, he's a national hero, and despite the ideas of Indira Gandhi that he was objecting to, he's still one of the national heroes. Not quite like Stepan Bandera in Ukraine, but there is something similar. In any case, what I'm driving towards, we should think of some historical parallels, similarities, which will help us better understand some phenomena. And then maybe the subtle force that we are discussing as part of our public diplomacy could be reinforced. And that is something that we can borrow from the Soviet legacy. Yes, we have to remember about the torture, which was part of that history, but also there were elements which were making Ukrainian diplomacy stronger. And there should be soft power, subtle power behind it, which would be empowering us, clearly understanding what should be relied on and what should not be touched. Thank you so much.
A book about history of this region of Central and Eastern Europe called his book Bloodlands. So the issue of history is very much complicated here, and I think that in communicating with our friends and partners in Big South, we have to concentrate on positive messages, positive example of Ukrainians' participation in development project, especially in the sphere of science, agriculture, medical science. Training that Ukraine provided to foreign specialists, foreign students. I personally met many of them, and even right now, those who studied in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, they have special feelings towards Ukraine, towards Ukrainian people. So let's maybe concentrate, or maybe not concentrate, prioritize these issues in our communications. Thank you.
Thank you. So I feel like we touched upon lots of issues in this discussion, like broad set of issues, and I feel like also pretty much every single discussion at this conference, it boiled down to the problem of Russian propaganda and Russian narratives that are really strong, and it's something that we have to prioritize, which is not a secret and it's not something new. Also, I probably would like to call on, because we have here some journalists from African countries and from other countries as well, and I think that to research more this issue of Ukrainian role in all those projects would be extremely interesting also for your audiences, but also for Ukraine, and I would like to encourage you, but it's also our work that we have to do. And just to sum up what we were discussing, the infrastructure projects, the the role of Ukrainian diplomats and diplomatic missions, the educational sphere, the support for the liberation movements, the military sphere. So all those spheres, Ukrainians were there, and we definitely need to know more about that, and that would help us to bring Ukrainian issue and cause closer to the minds and hearts of people of those nations. I would like to thank to our brilliant speakers for their insightful speeches and presentations, and I learned a lot from what you were saying, and hopefully you too, so please give a round of applause to them.